it's artists who not only can craft a good story, but also we can tell the story that's the hardest to tell. And that is the story about the impacts of climate solutions. So it's really not too hard to talk about the impacts of climate change. And I see people, when they speak, they go through the laundry list of all the horrors that are upon us. And they don't realize it, but they're actually closing people's minds, closing people down because they're getting overwhelmed. And not that we shouldn't talk about the impacts, but it's so helpful to talk about a single impact, maybe how it affects people locally, but then talk about how the world will be different when we enact these changes. And how do you tell a story that gets to that? Because that gets people engaged and excited, because you're then telling the story about what we're fighting for, not what we're fighting against. And that is where the energy is in a story.
Another episode of the Conscient podcast. I'm with Peterson Toscano, who I think is in South Africa. Is that right,
That's
Peterson?
absolutely right, yeah.
And your voice sounds lovely. Welcome to the show. I'm really happy to have you here because you're a fellow podcaster. You're also an artist and many other things. So why don't you start by just telling us a bit about who you are and what you do?
I describe myself as a quirky, queer Quaker concerned with comedy and climate change, which maybe is not helpful, but that's how I describe myself. I'm a performance artist. I'm a playwright, a comic, a Bible scholar, and now I am full-time pursuing climate communications as I don't know, it's sort of this big puzzle I'm trying to unravel as I create art around climate change, and in particular, connect with people who are doing art about climate change and just people pursuing solutions.
Well, that sounds like a very interesting endeavor, and I had a chance to look at some of your artwork in media, and we'll get to that. But I start every interview by just asking people who have heard some or all of the reality program what their thoughts are on the theme of reality and ecological grief. You know, when you listen to the program, what stood out for you, and what are your thoughts on that, the idea of reality and ecological grief?
It hit me at a very strange time because I was been experiencing some grief because I very recently lost a cousin who was very close to me, who died quite suddenly in a hit-and-run accident. And it was really helpful, actually, to listen to the show. And what I noticed more than what was going on in my head or even in my emotions was what was going on in my body. And how, I don't know, I just got more connected with my body listening to it and different places where I feel the pain. And I think with the ecological grief, that's a lot harder because I feel that I've been raised to be disembodied from the planet. And part of my own process as an artist, as a communicator, is to try to figure out how do I tap into that without it crushing me? Because I can be quite intuitive when it comes to people and, very empathetic. And I am afraid of being empathetic with the planet just because the pain, and the guilt is just so grand. I mean, it's just so big. And so listening to the program, I just sort of allowed myself to open up more to that and found myself sitting in nature listening to it, which is not how I normally listen to podcasts.
More and more, I now see, and more importantly, I now feel in my bones the state of things as they actually exist. Without social filters or unsustainable stories. So where do we go from here? And what about the notion of reality? It's sort of a duality between reality and denial, right? And that's something I struggle with. Like, what's real?
Yeah, and I think it's been such a distraction, right? Because you've got some people who, for the longest time, denied the reality of climate change. So it sort of lowered the bar for everybody. That if you just admitted reality, you were somehow progressive. And I blame my country, the U.S., for a lot of that. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And I think it's much harder to see where those of us who do acknowledge the science, where we are in denial. And I think part of it is I hear it when I hear presentations where people are talking about how horrible climate change is, how dangerous, how devastating, and then the solutions they present are so piddly in comparison. It's like, wait a minute, I thought this was just so incredibly difficult, and the solutions you're offering they don't match. And so I think that's what I was thinking about too, is just where is the spots where I'm not seeing my own denial?
Well, it's about awareness and being responsive to the information that you're receiving. Like when I started doing my daily Zen practice, I realized that I wasn't really in touch with what was really going on. And then when I started reading pieces like Facing Extinction by Catherine Ingram, it kind of woke me up to the fact that there's things happening in the environment that we can't change, the baked in climate materials that are there and that can't change, and the heating and all that. So I'm interested in fact, you have this dual role or multiple role as an artist, but also as a podcaster. So why don't we start with your role as a podcaster, and then we'll get to your art practice and maybe talk about some of the LGBTQ plus issues that you've been facing. So maybe start with Citizens Climate Radio. What is that about, and what are you learning through your work as a podcaster?
Citizens Climate Radio is a monthly show that is sponsored by Citizens Climate Education, which is connected to a group called Citizens Climate Lobby. We have a couple 100,000 volunteers who are earnestly seeking to change legislation to put a price on carbon. I was tasked to create the podcast over 2 years ago to do a couple things. One was just to encourage them, because some folks live in remote places and they may be one of the only people in their community that's really taking climate change seriously. Hopefully that's changed in 2 years. But I also was tasked with helping people understand the culture that we wanted to create through Citizens Climate Education, and that is we want to work with everybody. We want bipartisan solutions. We don't want to demonize people. We want to be able to work up with everyone who's willing to work, even if we don't agree on lots of things. And finally, it's a lot about education, both about how to talk about climate change in ways that are most effective, and the education of understanding the broad array of issues connected to climate change: immigration, racism, poverty, all sorts of things. And with that, I love to bring artists in. So every episode, I have a feature called The Art House, where I feature a different artist who is doing work around climate change.
And we just did an interview for that, so maybe one day you'll hear my voice.
That's right.
Well, I think that's great too, because that's you don't want to necessarily do a show only about art and climate change, because everything is interconnected, right? But to bring in to weave in the arts, I think is really great. Thanks for doing that. Artist Diego Galafasi. Art is a space where we can ask very difficult questions and explore things in a more open-ended way, and not be committed to solutions. And what about your art practice? I know you're a performer, but how do you, what kind of art do you do, and how does it relate to the climate emergency?
I'm a character actor and a playwright, and so I love to embody different characters to look at this issue in different ways. And some of them are incredibly silly and campy. because I really think with an issue this serious, it requires some comedy because we're so tense around it. And so very often when I'm speaking in front of an audience or I'm doing one of my shows, there's comedy as part of it. And that is strategic as well, because when people laugh, they relax and they open up emotionally. And I have a strategy where I'll get people laughing, and then I insert something incredibly tender because they're at a place where they can hear that thing. And I've found it to be a very useful strategy when talking about issues like around the Bible and religion, which people get very tense around, when talking about issues of sexuality, and now when talking about climate change. And I can give you a little sample if you wanted.
Sure.
So I have this one character named Tony Bafuzio. He's from the Bronx, New York. He's very much based on my dad, Pete Toscano, who's also from the Bronx. And I do this one monologue that is highly effective for people. All right, so climate change. Have you noticed with this whole climate change thing, there's been this huge uptick in polar bear imagery in the world and on the internet. But these photographers, they're amazing. They take these photographs and they tell whole stories. You see this polar bear, it's on an ice floe. It looks so sad. It looks so forlorn, right? It tugs at your heart. Like you want to go over and hug it, right? No, you don't want to hug it. It will rip you to shreds. They're very dangerous creatures, but still it's sad, right? How these polar bears have their habitat is shrinking so they can't go off and murder seals like they like to do. So you know what's happening? They're going up on land to Alaska. They go into people's rubbish bins and into landfills. They become a real nuisance. I actually don't like polar bears. They're dangerous and they're disgusting. The second most privileged white mammal on the planet. But, the problem is with climate change, it's not just warming up in the Arctic, it's also warming in other places, like in Central America, where there's this disease, this fungus that's spreading like wildfire, attacking coffee plants. It's called coffee leaf rust. It's a real thing. Look it up. Now, this is going to sound awful, but I don't know. I think I could live without polar bears. But a world without coffee, that's a dystopian future that I can't face.
That is very funny. And it does open your mind, right? Because there are a lot of people who might not like polar bears, but it's an icon, right? And so let's talk about it. Let's get rid of the stereotypes and get to what the real issue is, right?
Well, and also most of us will never see a polar bear in the wild, right? It's not something in our everyday life, and so emotionally, it's hard to connect with that. For a lot of people. Some people, yes, because they love animals so much and all. But for the average person, it's not their everyday life. But the thought that something you count on every day suddenly being scarce, going extinct, something like coffee, well, that actually hits someone in the gut, literally.
And to also just to know where coffee comes from and some of the human rights issues in its cultivation and its transportation and just the full picture of what we consume and what it means to enjoy something that maybe you could consume differently, through fair trade or whatever. There's so many issues that come up with awareness of where something comes from or what's really happening. Here in Canada, the polar bear situation is very real. People are seeing them move south. Mm-hmm. Because of lack of food, lack of traditional food sources. So there's tremendous transformation and they're used for marketing, and I understand why, but I'd rather know the real story. And speaking of stories, you're a good storyteller, and that brings us to art, right? Because in my podcast, I quote a couple of writers, Charles Eisenstein, but also a Canadian Indigenous writer, Richard Wagamese, about the power of stories. To use the act of breathing to shape air into sounds that take on the context of language, that lifts and transports those that hear it, takes them beyond what they think and know and feel, and empowers them to think and feel and know even more. We're storytellers, really. That's what we do. that is our power as humans. What has been your experience around the role of art, and storytelling and imagery? How do you think it makes a difference in something as complex and the scale of the climate emergency?
We listen to stories with a different part of our brain than we would listen to, say, a lecture. And this part of the brain that we listen to stories with is far less critical and judgmental. So, for instance, if I'm standing in front of a university audience, which I've done a lot, if I were to start and say, I want to talk about climate change and, the effects of it, people's guards will go up, even if they are concerned about climate change, because they're going to be judgmental. Like, what's he going to say? What's his approach? What's going on here? But if I were to start by saying, let me tell you a story, immediately it slides it into this other part of our brains, which is far less critical. And we're more willing to listen deeply. And that's really important to understand. With that, it's artists who not only can craft a good story. I mean, it is a craft, right? You can get better at it. There are certain techniques that we have. But also, we can tell the story that's the hardest to tell. And that is the story about the impacts of climate solutions. So it's really not too hard to talk about the impacts of climate change. And I see people, when they speak, they go through the laundry list of all the horrors that are upon us. And they don't realize it, but they're actually closing people's minds, closing people down because they're getting overwhelmed. And not that we shouldn't talk about the impacts, but it's so helpful to talk about a single impact, maybe how it affects people locally, but then talk about how the world will be different when we enact these changes. And how do you tell a story that gets to that? Because that gets people engaged and excited, because you're then telling the story about what we're fighting for, not what we're fighting against. And that is where the energy is in a story.
And I agree. And a conversation can be a story as well. I don't know if you know the Green Dreamer podcast out of California. Kamaya Shane, I think is her name. And I listen to it regularly, and it's very moving because often it's story-based explanations of not only the problem, and I think it's too simplistic to say the solution. There isn't
right.
one solution. But like you say, the impact of climate strategies or solutions that are multiple can be very inspiring and bring us out of that sort of numbness of not knowing what to do. I find also that accepting reality helps. It helped me just be energized to do things that I think are meaningful to not just save the world, because I don't know that we can save the world as it is. That whole idea of if we just fix climate change, everything will be fine. It's the whole system that's problematic. It's what got us here. It's a 500-year history of colonization, and I don't need to lecture you on this, but I'm opening up to that big picture, and it's scary, but it's also very empowering to understand the full picture, and then to see how you can fit in and work with others, because it's a collective effort. Anyway, Peterson, it's fun talking to you because we have some common ground around our belief in the role of the arts. I'd like to move now to the LGBTQ community's work that you've talked about and you've performed about. What are where's that community at in terms of its relationship to climate change? I assume it's similar to other communities, but maybe there are some specificities you'd like to share.
Well, yes and no. And that, obviously I would say the vast majority of LGBTQ people are aware of climate change and are sympathetic and want it to be fixed. But we have to look at the history of the environmental movement, which, up until recently, hasn't really been challenged. But at least in the United States, it has been very much the mainstream environmental movement has been very much a white, middle-class, heterosexual movement that is concerned with rural spaces. Well, many of us queer people, we fled those rural spaces and found refuge in cities. And, and even when I go camping with my husband, I love camping, going camping as a gay male couple, well, a lot of campgrounds in the U.S. are sort of a recreation of suburbia. But I don't know yet who my neighbors are and how they're going to react to me and my husband. So going into nature, going to rural spaces traditionally has not always been a positive thing. And this is true of for women who camp by themselves or go into nature by themselves or with other women, with people of color. There's this, challenge of who gets to be in these spaces. And there's another, philosophical thing. For so long, you had the opponents to LGBTQ people saying that what we feel, who we are, is unnatural, that we are unnatural, and in many ways have tried to disconnect us from the natural world. And up until recently, much of the climate movement has been about nature and the environment. And that's why I'm so excited about the environmental justice movement that has been going on for decades, but now is finally getting much more visibility because it's about often cityscapes, and where many of us live, where most people live. And that changes the discussion because then it becomes about human rights. When I first became concerned about climate change, now going on 8 years, the first question that popped into my head was, what is a queer response to climate change? Meaning, how does it affect us differently than other people? And what do we have in our toolbox to apply to this? And gosh, what a deep question. I found myself really thinking deeply about it and literally could do a whole podcast series just on that because it's just so rich. But when you talk about reality, I think one of the things that has helped me is accepting the reality that not that climate change is coming, climate change is here. And yes, it's hard baked no matter what we do today. And indeed, hard times are coming. And that's important for me to really grasp because I need to prepare for this. We need to prepare for these hard times. And I'm seeing so many people who rightfully are concerned about mitigation, but they're not thinking and talking and acting about adaptation as much and preparing for these hard times. And I'm concerned about my people, the LGBTQ homeless kids, the elderly who don't like to go into nursing homes. I'm concerned about how extreme weather affects them and how they're more vulnerable than maybe some non-LGBTQ people. And that's why I'm getting together with other queer folks about what can we do to build resilience and to build on the resilience that we already see demonstrated in our communities.
Law professor Shalanda Baker. Will we redesign systems to replicate the current structures of power and control? Or will we reimagine our systems to benefit those who are so often left out of discussions regarding systems design? Well, I guess it's all part of that notion of a just transition as opposed to fixing a singular problem. And I think that took off in the early COVID days where people were much more aware of how we need to all move together in addressing the issues that we face, as opposed to just doing what we did before, but with better technology. So I appreciate your talking about that, and I encourage people to listen to your. I think you have a specific podcast around another series that you do.
Yeah, two other podcasts. One's called the Bible Bash podcast, which really looks at justice issues through the lens of Bible stories that I go back and forth with a friend of mine, Liam Hooper, who's a trans guy, a Jewish trans guy, theologian. And so that's the Bible Bash podcast. And then my other podcast is Bubble and Squeak, which is quirky and serious, and it taps on these things in all sorts of alternative ways. And I also play a lot with sound.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're nearing the end of our conversation, but I wanted to ask if there's anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to share with the Conscient Podcast listeners.
I think it's to just reiterate this fact about adaptation. A lot of people don't have the stomach to see about changing legislation. And I think telling people to lower their carbon footprint is a nice thing. It's a noble thing to do. But really, it's going to take big systems to change. But when it comes to adapting, to preparing for these big storms, We can start that today because the biggest, most important thing we can do to address climate change is to build closer, tight-knit communities. That's what saves so many lives when there's an extreme weather event. So anything we can do to build those communities and the areas that you care about, if it's the people without homes, if it's pets, there's all these things that need to be considered when extreme weather comes. And I find people get more excited about that than seeing about changing legislation. Thank goodness there are people who are working on that, but we don't all have to do that.
And obviously, it's a social movement, and arts and culture are at the heart of our lives because we are people who consume music and stories, and we are creative by nature. Whether the art is coming from a professional sector or from the community sector, for me, in a way, it doesn't matter. As long as people are engaging with creativity, with the social fabric around them, they will figure things out. I live in a community here in Ottawa where we at a very micro level, there are very important things happening. And so I try to balance out where do I live and what can I do right around my corner with the international work and that international solidarity that we need to create amongst arts and cultural workers to get our act together and for us to be, doing our share. I mean, what is our share? I mean, there's so much that arts and culture workers can do, and yet they work often in very difficult circumstances. So there's an economic and a support structure that needs to be built in there. Anyway, we could go on and on, but I'm going to just stop there and encourage people to check out your work. And I'm sure you'll be doing ongoing podcasts and creative work, and maybe we can talk again down the road and just see where we're at as podcasters and as artists. But I want to thank you for taking the time to join me today, and wish you all the best in all of your work.
And thank you so much for elevating artists who are doing climate work.
My pleasure.